So our first McGrath awardee this evening is Maya Drayton. Maya is a sophomore health sciences major from Hazel Crest, Illinois. She wrote her winning research for ASI 120, the development of Western culture in a global context, part of the first year core curriculum with Professor Elizabeth Mackey. It's titled Reconstruction's Black Church and its Role in the Healing Process. For showing us the central role of the Black Church in US Reconstruction by your historiographical study of it. It is my honor, on behalf of the McGrath Awards Committee and the entire University of Dayton, to present Ms. Maya Drayton with the 2021 McGrath Award for Common Academic Program Research in Catholic Intellectual Traditions. Maya, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn things over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. As previously stated, I was a first-year student in the core ASI 120 program. And in that program, I was assigned to write a historiography, which is a history about the ways that historians have interpreted historical topics over long periods of time on a topic connected to Reconstruction. I initially wanted to study the post-traumatic stress that African-American people must have felt and how they dealt with that. However, this is not something that historians were looking at during the time constraints of my assignment. But as I did more and more reading, I saw that the church was a common denominator in the conversation around healing. I spent the majority of the second semester of my freshman year reading several books and articles, a few of which are considered to be foundational studies of the Black experience during Reconstruction, for the sole purpose of understanding the role the Black church played in the Black community from the years 1863 to 1877, a time better known as American Reconstruction. The Black church was, and in many ways still is, a key component of the emerging Black community and was crucial for the political and social lives of Black people at this time. I chose to study this topic because I wish to understand how the recently freed Black community attempted to find their place in American society and how they found the strength within themselves to overcome adversity. Also, this topic speaks to me personally given the fact that I am an African-American woman involved in the Baptist Church. Beyond this, my historiography also explores how historians' interpretations of the role that the Black church played in the formation of the Black community have changed over time through their language. By paying attention to the language, I was able to see how historians, and therefore societies, views of Black people changed over time. I also used this lens to determine which of my 7 sources I thought were the clearest in telling the overall impact that the church had. Other criteria I used included which had the most detail and which explored the largest range of the church's involvement in the different aspects of the everyday lives of Black people. At this point, I like to describe some of the issues and stresses Black people dealt with as I learned about them during my research. Recently freed Black men and women had little to no support after the end of slavery. Every aspect of their lives had been changed, and with these changes came new, and what I could imagine felt insurmountable at times, issues. Some of these issues included spousal disputes, whether that be acts of domestic violence or adultery, the schooling of their children, and just the overall maintaining of their family. Whether you were a couple or not, everyone had their own economic concerns, whether it was procuring a job in general or earning fair and equal wages in the position you currently hold. Black people were also devastatingly underrepresented and unprotected by the legal system and politics overall. Add in the constant danger of living as a Black man or woman in America and the threat that posed to the Black family, Black individuals, and any type of individual or community progress. Whether it's urban or city life, these issues persisted. Organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau, designed for this very issue, did not come into fruition until 2 years after Reconstruction started. So who are Black people to turn to for assistance? This is where the church comes into play. They turn to their pastors, ministers, and churches for support. The church helped with politics, education, and economics. One of the many consistencies seen throughout my sources was Black pastors and ministers' involvement in politics. For example, in his study, Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the first Black historians to study the period of Reconstruction, mentions how Reverend James Lynch will go on to become the Secretary of the State for Mississippi. And William Montgomery's, who is an instructor of history, account, Under Their Own Vine and Fig Tree, the African American Church in the South, 1865 to 1900, he touches on how congregations would elect their own ministers, who would then go on to chair committees, draft resolutions and petitions, and influence debates. Other ministers mentioned throughout my research for their role in legislature include Reverend Henry M. Turner and Reverend James Porter. When it comes to the issue of education, churches were involved heavily. As Carter G. Woodson, a well-known Black scholar whose studies focus on the African diaspora, mentions in his study entitled The History of the Negro Church, how several colleges were opened by different denominations, including Shaw University opened by Baptists, Stower College opened by Free Will Baptists, St. Augustine opened by Episcopals, and many more. But churches did not just influence higher education. Montgomery touched on how churches acted as schoolhouses and how educated members, whether they be clergy or lay people, would serve as teachers. Andrew Billingsley, a Black social scientist considered to be an expert in African American culture, in his study, Mighty Like a River, The Black Church and Social Reform, mentions how E.K. Love, a Baptist pastor, was not only an advocate for higher education, but had the chance to attend what is now known as Morehouse College on his own church's dime. Economically, the church was Economically, the church was a huge resource. In his study, Billingsley focuses on what occurred in Savannah, Georgia. He mentions how Black churches gave rise to all Black-owned mutual aid societies, banks, insurance companies, and several other businesses. One of the most successful businesses that the church invested in was the Savannah Tribune, a newspaper that is still alive today. Unfortunately, 6 out of my 7 sources failed to note the relationship between Black women and the church during Reconstruction. Luckily, Jacqueline Jones, an American social historian, does not fall into this category with her study, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family from Slavery to the Present. Jones discusses how Black women found both emotional and physical strength within the church, which allowed them to get through their day-to-day lives. Depending on the church, Black elderly women were held in positions of respect, as they were seen as the younger generation's connection to the ancestors and deemed spiritual mothers. Now, I would like to pivot to my discussion of language. As I stated earlier, one of the focuses of my historiography was looking at how historians discuss Black people. An important part of the narrative of the church is the way that historians use language to tell that story. In my research paper, the sources are arranged in chronological order. This makes the language analysis quite simple, since it allows one to see the language progression directly. The oldest historical study I used was W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. In this study, Du Bois uses the terms colored and Negro when referencing Black people. Since the book was written in 1935, this usage was not surprising and I used it as my base. Black people in the 1930s were referred to as either colored or Negro. Exactly 28 years later, Franklin Frazier, considered to be one of, if not the most prominent African American sociologist of the 20th century, does his own deep dive into Reconstruction with his book, The Negro Church in America. Frazier solely uses the word Negro in his study. Here I made what I consider to be a fair assumption. Black people were still referred to as Negroes in the 1960s. Frazier also utilized the word mulatto, a term whose use is still debated today in some circles while being completely condemned or accepted in others. My next study will push me forward to the 80s, specifically 1982. Now I am 19 years from Frazier's The Negro Church in America and 47 years from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. Here, with Clarence Walker's A Rock in a Weary Land, the African Methodist Episcopal Church during the Civil War and Reconstruction, is where I first began to see a positive shift in the language of historians. Walker, an ordained minister among many other things, referred to Black people using the terms Black and Negro. Though this is true, I believe it useful to note that Walker fell back on Negro more times than Black. I took this to mean referring to Black people as just that, Black, was something that was in its earliest stages in the 80s, but of course, this was just my own opinion. In the same decade, specifically 3 years later in 1985, Jacqueline Jones did her own investigation into the lives of Black women. Jones, unsurprisingly, reflected the progression I initially saw in Walker's study as she referred to these Black women as just that, Black. At this point in my research, I assumed it was fair to say that as of the 80s, historians have shifted to modern day terms when it comes to discussing and analyzing Black people. This assumption is only backed up by my next source, William Montgomery's Under Their Own Vine and Fig Tree, written in 1993. Montgomery uses the terms Black and African American in his analysis. This was further evidence to show historians change and how they discuss Black people, as seen in Jones and even Walker's account. My second most current source was written in 2003 by Andrew Billingsley. In his study, Mighty Like a River, Billingsley solely uses the words Black and African American. Of course, this is not surprising given the fact that it was written just 18 years ago. I'm only 3 years older than this book, so seeing a historian using such outdated language would have been a shock, to say the least. My seventh and final source was written by Carter G. Woodson. His study, entitled The History of the Negro Church, was published in 2018, and he uses the terms Negro and Black instead of solely Black. This would seem off-putting, but as the summary states, the book was originally published in 1921 and then republished in 2018 to allow access to a newer generation of scholars. Still, Woodson offered a new perspective to my theme of language progression. Seeing this was originally published in 1921, 14 years before Du Bois's work, it reveals that the term Black was around and being used in academic circles. The fact that Du Bois and Woodson were Black men themselves makes the study of language even more interesting than it was before. It made me think about and wonder how Black people had seen and talked about themselves at this time, instead of just my original focus on historians. I believe it is worth noting that each account I have mentioned to you today presented itself as unbiased and therefore truly allowed me a glimpse of how society saw and discussed Black people in these individual time periods. And though this is not something I necessarily focus too much on, I believe the titles of these different studies also offers a look at language progression and how Black people saw themselves versus how historians saw them. As Du Bois' study is entitled Black Reconstruction and Written in the 30s, yet he uses a word like Negro, and Walker's study is entitled A Rock in a Weary Land, the African Methodist Episcopal Church during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and written in the 80s, yet he also uses the word Negro. In addition to the contributions of the church that I previously highlighted, there's so much more that I am not able to go into detail about now, but I would like to briefly mention a few of them. The Black church had a hand in labor unions, fought for the enfranchisement of Black men, and served as a meeting area for organizations and societies that worked for the betterment of the Black community. Also, when the white Methodist Episcopal Church was considering creating an entirely separate body for Black people, the Baptist Church offered a place for them, causing a lot of Black people to move away from the Emmy churches and towards the Baptist ones. There is no denying that the Black church was instrumental in the lives of Black people during Reconstruction. It gave them the tools they needed to survive and thrive in a world that barely even considered them to be people. But what is the church's role in the lives of Black people today? The Catholic intellectual tradition holds, among many other things, that the human person is an image of God. What does that mean and look like today? We are still fighting the same issues of systemic racism, white supremacy, and overall racial injustice that I have highlighted for you here. Knowing this, where do we go from here, and how will the church supply us with the tools to get there? Thank you.